21. I'm going to invite David Kemp to speak to and move the motion standing in his name. You have up to 10 minutes.
Madam Chair, members of Synod, if you sit quietly here in York and listen very carefully, you can just catch the alleluias coming from Canterbury Diocese. It's been quite an exciting week. Earlier on, our 2015 idea of having a CNC for the Bishop of Dover finally got over the line. And here we are with our 2017 Diocesan Synod motion, which has reached the agenda with dizzying speed. But we're here. The motion comes from a little Kentish village called Smarden, which has a fresh expression in it and has found that innovation and flexibility have run into the rules. Something has to give. Fresh expressions are fully church. We're living in a mixed ecology church. The church is changing and must change if the decline in membership is to be halted. So fresh expressions need all the help they can get. There are two parts to this motion. First, the question of qualification for membership of the PCC, and second, qualification for membership of the electoral roll and its application form. But can I make it very clear, we are not expecting answers this evening. We are simply asking for a review, a careful look at the issues and a thought-through proposal coming back to Synod. Two of the amendments which have been tabled arise from real experience of either people exploiting unexpected loopholes in the rules or not observing the spirit of the rules. On the question of PCC membership, there's an issue about whether members of the Church of England who are not communicants can be PCC members. There are fresh expressions across the country which are non-Eucharistic, but are integral parts of their church. It is possible for their members to be on the PCC, but only if the Bishop's Council in the diocese agrees with a possibly time-consuming and complicated scheme proposed by the parish. It is not difficult to imagine the parish and the Bishop's Council having differing theological opinions on the matter. And underneath lies the question of where the decision should be made, in the parish or at the diocesan hub. The question about membership of the electoral roll is probably more fundamental, particularly for a church which struggles to even define membership of itself. So perhaps we might leave that to any review. But the application form is a nightmare. 2 sheets of A4, are you this, are you that? And if I was pedantic, I wouldn't get past question 2A, which raises the question of whether I'm a member of the Church of England. The form was obviously designed with middle-class, educated applicants in mind. But we are not solely in that world anymore, and nor should we be. Without prejudicing any review, can't we think out of the old-fashioned box and, for instance, radically simplify the form but have any supporting material easily available on an app which every clergy person and church warden can carry on their phone? There are enough barriers in the way of becoming a member of the Church of England. Let's reduce at least one form. So, this motion is about a review to make our church more accessible and its rules more consistent with what is actually happening in the parishes. I beg to move.
This item is now open for debate. There are a number of requests to speak from Zoom, so I'll be looking for them to indicate in the usual way. I call for her maiden speech, Sandy Turner. You have up to 5 minutes.
Sandy Turner, Chelmsford 275. Thank you, Chair, for calling me. For my maiden speech, I was expecting a 2-minute limit, so you're in for a treat. In our secular world, as already been mentioned, it is increasingly anachronistic to assume that everybody on our electoral roll is a Christian or even sympathetic to the mission and ministry of the local church. For example, in my own parish, 1/3 of our electoral roll are not invested in the life of our church, socially, spiritually, or sadly, financially, because they simply never attend. And my reason for supporting this motion and this really worthwhile review is actually because I feel very strongly that we are to protect the gospel mission and ministry of our local church, which is our greatest asset. Let me paint you a picture for a minute, if I may. Your electoral roll officer receives application forms from 15 people. However, these are people with little or no connection to your church, but they reside in your parish and they've ticked the boxes, declaring themselves to be baptised and, that tricky one, a member of the Church of England. So they are duly enrolled. At your APCM, however, it becomes clear that this group are vehemently opposed to the mission and ministry of your church. Next, 1 or 2 of them decide to stand for the vacant positions you have on your PCC. Now, it's very difficult to prove if someone has been a communicant at least 3 times in the past year, more difficult as it could be in any church that is in communion with us, and even more difficult because of COVID. So we take them at their word and they take their places on our PCC. At meetings, these new members then work together to frustrate and oppose the gospel mission and ministry of your church, and there actually is very little you can do about it without making things worse. Far-fetched? Not really. This is my experience. This is my electoral roll. This is my PCC. This is my church. And it has led to some very strained relationships and tricky PCC meetings where we waste too much time fighting fires. And worse still, our efforts to be faithful witnesses to Christ whom we love in our local community are questioned and frustrated at every turn. However, I don't want to leave you feeling sad for us, because despite the fact that we now know the cost of being salt and light, we continue wholeheartedly to offer ministry to anyone and to everybody who comes to us. We have learnt to cling on to Jesus alone. We have learnt to be bolder in how we speak the truth in love. And we have been ever humbled as we see Christ at work, even in these really difficult times. Because I was reminded that unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labour in vain. So, Synod, this could be your church in 3 or 5 or 10 years' time. So I urge you to vote in favour of this motion. Let's get this review and see where we go from there. Thank you very much.
We're now going to take a couple of speeches from Zoom. First of all, we're going to take Matt Beer, followed by Holly Adams for her maiden speech. You both have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Matthew Beer, Lichfield 143. Thank you for calling me. Whilst I broadly accept the motion for review for qualifications for PCCs and can see the heart behind the motion from the Canterbury Diocese and that of the St Michael's Smarden PCC, I would, however, ask us to resist this motion for a number of reasons. If we pass this motion, we may be naively stepping into something that we may later need to fix. Firstly, that in the document GS 2254A, the new forms of worship, fresh expressions, messy church, bishops' mission initiatives are non-Eucharistic. Regular communicants is what the regulations call for, It doesn't state weekly, monthly, or just regularly. Why not make these vitally important expressions of church Eucharistic? If we aren't allowing these communities of people to receive communion, are we truly showing them what it is to be part of the church and withholding the sacrament from them unintentionally? Remembering that, of course, the first ever fresh expression of church was that of Acts 2:42, and it was a Eucharistic community of faith. Secondly, if the fresh expression of church is within a parish context, why not encourage some of the PCC to join that fresh expression? And that way you have the representation needed. So many of the people in fresh expressions, bishops' mission initiatives, want to cut down on the bureaucracy and not become part of the perceived problem. Thirdly, as the leader of an extra-parochial bishops' mission initiative, I would earnestly urge us to think twice about the inclusion of BMIs to be represented in PCCs, particularly as they already have articles of association, CIO, charitable incorporated organizations, or the bishop, that they are held to account by episcopal visitations and reviews regularly. Please don't add to the burden by inclusion in the PCCs. For me, who serve in a BMI over 3 deaneries, an exceptional amount of work and frustration could be caused in needing to have representation in all those PCCs. Telford Minster, the BMI that I lead, is Eucharistic, is self-governing, and via the Articles of Association, deeply Anglican, and would not want that representation of PCCs. It's quite enough on its own to manage. Please, by all means, have a review, but think carefully about how we might include bishops' mission initiatives and how they will be affected. Please resist this motion. Thank you.
I call Holly Adams, after which we're going to take the First Amendment. I'm afraid we can't hear you. No, we still can't hear you. Bear with us.
Holly Adams, Canterbury 262.
Great, we've got you.
Yay. Thank you for calling me chair. I rather hoped that my maiden speech might be on a slightly sexier topic than the wording of an electoral roll form, but this is Synod, so maybe this is as sexy as it gets. I find myself compelled to speak because I believe this motion asks us how much we are really committed to inclusivity and to mission. There are 2 issues here that I'd like to just quickly address. Firstly, the actual communicant criteria in the model rules, which means that we have a default which excludes people in non-Eucharistic worshipping communities. As encouraging as it is that parishes can make their own rules, I'd like to challenge the fact that our model rules, which most parishes will continue to use, either because they don't know that they have a choice or because they don't have the energy to go through the scheme, offer a default of exclusion. If we wish to be a church that values diverse expressions of worship equally, then surely we need a default that's inclusive, not exclusive. The second issue that the motion raises around the wording of the electoral roll form being inaccessible and not serving us missionally is true not only in fresh expressions of church, but also in traditional expressions of church. Until this year, I was electoral roll officer in my church for 6 years. Our parish is situated in the 10% most deprived wards in Kent and amongst the most deprived in the country. Our community has many gifts, but high levels of literacy and education are not one of them. I have had so many conversations over the years with people who wish to join the roll as a way of formalising their sense of belonging to the church, as well as to enable full participation in APCMs and on the PCC, and yet find the form inaccessible to the extreme. Yes, I can help to fill out the form. Yes, I can apologise for how complicated it is. But frankly, I am tired of apologising on behalf of a church that makes it almost impossible for people who are unfamiliar with its practices to participate fully in its life. So we can choose to continue to enshrine our practices in inaccessible language and legalism that make people feel like our church is not a place for them. Or we can choose to find a way to do what needs to be done accessibly and inclusively. And like any issue of accessibility, this work will not be convenient for us. Adapting the forms and changing the language will take time and effort. But we need to not simply settle for slightly improved, and instead push the boundaries of what's possible. Because if we are a church that seeks to reach, meaningfully engage with, and be changed by those at the margins, if we are truly a Christ-shaped church, then we need to pay proper attention to the ways that our processes prevent diverse people from participating fully in our life. And I want to emphasize that the motion is not satisfied by or expectant of immediate answers, but asks for a comprehensive review of this small, not very sexy part of our church life in order to more faithfully and effectively be the missional church we're called to be. Please, Synod, support this motion with me.
We're going to take the first amendment now, so I would like to invite Mr. Clive Scowen to come and speak to and move item 78. Thank you. You have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Scowen, London 358. I'm really here speaking as the Chair of the Elections Review Group and a member of the Business Committee, and this amendment is supported by the Chair of the Business Committee. He asked me to say, so that he doesn't have to get up and say it himself. The purpose of the amendment is very simple. It's really to address the request for a review to the Business Committee rather than the Archbishop's Council, since the review sought falls within the remit of the Elections Review Group, which is a subcommittee of the Business Committee. The review group will shortly be agreeing our programme of work for this quinquennium, so it is timely for the request for a review to come at this point. But with your permission, Chair, I'd also like, on behalf of the group, to comment more widely on the motion and on the amendments. The requirement for PCC members to be actual communicant members of the Church of England dates back to the setting up of the Church Assembly, the predecessor of General Synod, in 1919. But as recently as 2018, the Revision Committee for the Church Representation of Ministers measure considered whether the requirement was still justified and concluded that it was, a conclusion which Synod did not challenge. It seems to me entirely appropriate for it to be the norm that those involved in the governance of our church should be participating in its sacramental life, feeding regularly on Christ at his table. Should the rules permit exceptions to that norm? Well, they already do. Mr. Kemp's referred to the fact that is also referred to in the Secretary-General's paper, that it will be open to an APCM to make a scheme to disapply that requirement in whole or in part in that particular parish, subject only to the consent of the Diocesan Bishops' Council. The grounds on which a Bishop's Council can refuse to consent to such a scheme are actually quite limited. And I am confident that if a parish made a compelling case, they would be likely to get it approved. And there will probably soon be another route. The miscellaneous provisions measure, which was given first consideration this afternoon, contains a clause which would permit the bishop to allow an individual to serve on a PCC despite not being an actual communicant or even on the electoral roll. So the dispensation which the sponsors of this motion seek is already in hand. And frankly, the miscellaneous provisions measure is likely to become law rather more quickly than the upshot of any review conducted by the Elections Review Group. But the motion seeks a wider review of qualifications for membership of a PCC, and the review group stands ready to undertake such a review. But a review by its very nature is open-ended. There is no guaranteed outcome. The conclusion might be that there's no change is needed, or it might be that radical reform is needed. we will need evidence to inform the review, which I hope members of Synod will be able to provide. The electoral roll application form necessarily requires a lot of information, but it is appropriate from time to time to review whether it, and indeed any other forms of that the Church's rules prescribe, could be improved to make them more user-friendly, particularly to a wider cross-section of society. So the Election Review Group would be glad to consider it, and again interested to hear any ideas that members, or indeed the sponsors of the motion, have for improving it. Again, there's no guarantee that we'll succeed in that endeavour, but we should try. Amanda Robbie's second amendment seeks to extend the review further to cover disqualification provisions and how they can be made more effective. Again, this is something which the Elections Review Group would happily consider as part of its ongoing responsibility to keep the church representation rules under review and to seek to improve them. Her first amendment seeks to remove from the motion the reference to the existence of bishops' mission initiatives. And I feel that may be a wise thing, particularly having heard Matt Beer. The fact of the matter is that fresh expressions of church are enormously wide in their scope and size and what they're seeking to achieve. And clearly the sort of mission initiative of which Matt is the leader would not be one that would be seeking representation on the local parish's PCC. But, thank you, but Messy Church,
You're welcome.
Is very different. Thank you, Synod. Please support the amendment.
I now invite David Kemp to come and confirm whether he accepts or does not accept this amendment. Thank you. You have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Clive, for a helpful addition to the debate. You know more about the Archbishop's Council and the Business Committee and the Election Review Group than I do. I'm happy to accept that amendment to the motion.
And so now item 78 is open for debate. Yes, you, sir. The speech limit for this item is now reduced to 3 minutes. Thank you.
Peter Adams, 392 St Albans. I understand what Clive has brought here, but I hadn't been intending to speak on the main motion, but actually as I listen to it and then hear Clive, I'm just inclined to think this is not the right way. At the heart of the item the main motion we're considering is the mission of the church and then the continuation and strengthening of the mission of the church by bringing people into full membership. I think that's a mission issue, and as such I would say it belongs in the Archbishop's Council, not in the Business Committee, which is more about process. So I would urge you to do that. In relation to its part in the whole motion, I don't come from a village, I come from a really deprived town in the home counties, from Luton. A 900-year-old church that faces exactly the same issues in terms of bringing people in from our town centre community, as I'm hearing and I know takes place in villages. As I say, this is a mission issue. Let's keep it, and let's look at how we bring governance at a local level within this exciting new dimension of church that we have. And I'd like to see the Archbishop's Council handling that. Thank you.
Thank you. I see no one else standing to speak, so we're going to put item 78 to the vote by show of hands. Those in favour of item 78? Those against, please show. Item 78 is carried. And so we move on to the second amendment, which is item 79. So can I invite Venerable Fiona Gibson to come and speak to and move the amendment in her name? You have up to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Hereford 128. Thank you, Chair. I'd like to make clear at the outset that I am fully supportive of the general tenor of this motion. The time is ripe for a review of qualifications for PCC members and of electoral roll application forms. I recognise that people express their sense of belonging to a church in a variety of ways, whether that be attending what one might provocatively term a traditional expression, like BCP Evensong, or a fresh expression like Messy Church. So I shall be voting in favour of the substantive motion, irrespective of the outcome of this amendment. I am, however, concerned about possible unintended consequences of the review if it were simply to propose removing the requirement for PCC members to be actual communicants and leave it there. This amendment, therefore, simply seeks to propose some parameters around the review. Under the Parochial Church Council's powers measure of 1956, part of the statutory functions of the PCC involve cooperation with the minister in promoting in the parish the whole mission of the church: pastoral, evangelistic, social and ecumenical. It seems to follow from that PCC membership entails more than simply being a trustee or custodian of an important heritage and community asset, though it certainly does include that. PCC membership involves exercising leadership of a spiritual dimension, specifically a Christian spiritual dimension, which needs to be upheld in any revision. The Secretary-General highlights in his briefing note GS 22454B the potential consequences for houses of laity in deanery, diocesan and general synods of simply removing the requirement for communicant status without putting in place other safeguards. As a rural archdeacon, I both know and understand the desire and need to involve members of the wider community, people who love, value and are committed to their church building as an integral part of the life of their village in making decisions about the church. But I think we need to find a new way to do that so that they are involved in genuine partnership and governance, but not just adjust PCC membership requirements. This motion, if we were to pass it unamended, would of course only call for a review, and that review is much needed. But given that Christian spiritual leadership is part of the statutory duties of a PCC, I firmly believe we need to set this specific parameter around the review. I beg to move the amendment at item 79, standing in my name.
Thank you. I now invite David Kemp to come and respond to whether he accepts or does not accept the amendment.
I'm very grateful to Fiona for the conversations that we've been able to have in these last 2 or 3 days about the motion and about what lies behind her amendment, and I'm happy to accept it.
Thank you. We now begin a debate on item 79. Okay. I call James Kerry, please. Followed by Robin Lunn. Thank you. 3 minutes, please, if you would.
James Carey, 246, Bath and Wells, and I also represent the House of Laity on the Archbishop's Council, who until recently were meant to be looking at this review, should the Synod be minded to ask for it. I welcome the main motion, given our vision and strategy of a mixed ecology which needs to be explored in terms of oversight and governance. And this is a very serious thing. In Acts 14, we read how Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for each church and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord, in whom they had put their trust. And I think this is inviting us to wonder in whom we will put our trust. Now, how that passage relates exactly to PCC membership, I will leave to the theologians. And I do look forward to the moment in glory when someone explains the governance of the Church of England to the Apostle Paul. Can I be there when someone does that, please? But let's put it another way, in a simpler way. My next biggest passion after the Bible, which is cricket. If you're running a village cricket club, would you wish to invite people to run the club who ultimately don't like cricket? Maybe they like TMS and tea and cake. Maybe they like short grass or white clothes. Maybe they're passionate about giving the kids something to do. But if they don't actually like the game of cricket, and many don't, and that's fine, sooner or later there will be problems with the direction of that cricket club. And many of us have witnessed organisations, clubs and societies disintegrate in that way. And to see that happen in a parish church or some other fresh expression is heartbreaking and damages the mission of the church in a community. So we need to be careful here in whom we put our trust, which is why I support this amendment of this really helpful motion in the context of reviewing what we do mean by church membership, so that we can be a welcoming church for a nation that has no idea how much the Lord Jesus Christ loves them. So I support this amendment. Thank you for calling me Chair.
After Robin Lunn, I call the Chair of the House of Clergy. Thank you.
Robin Lunn, Worcester, 432. I'd like to speak in favour of the amendment and absolutely in favour of the original motion as well. I think we're perhaps overcomplicating this. I sense that the Canterbury diocese, when they first, or the deanery that first brought this forward, the key word here is review. The previous speaker spoke about used a cricketing analogy. I'll also use one. I think we're in danger. It's like a batsman facing a spin bowler and wondering which way the ball's going to turn, or actually this is going straight on with the arm. As I said, the key word is review. I think I would differ from some of the previous speakers, and I think that certainly in my own parish we've had the opposite issue. We've had the issue where we have three types of services: BCP, alternative worship, and informal church. Now, many of the people involved with the informal church who regularly worship and have taken communion have not been happy to complete electoral roll forms for the simple reason they say, well, where's the app? Can we download it? I absolutely hope that the review comes up with creating an app like we have the excellent Synod app, like we have for many other things. That is the sort of thing that the review should be doing, looking at ways of making the electoral roll form, even if we don't change the wording, make the way you complete it much easier and more straightforward. So I think a review is really important here. I like the amendment because, as I said, it's putting it within the parameters of the church. I hope that we support this enthusiastically tonight, have the review, and then let's look at ways of making this more straightforward. Thank you.
After the Chair of the House of Clergy, I'm going to be testing the mind of Synod on a motion for closure on this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Luke Miller, 163 London. I'd love to be there when our Blessed Lord explains cricket to St Paul. I'd very much like to support this amendment, and I'd like to make three brief points about it. First of all, the amendment makes the point about habitual worship. Having attempted to do this, it's enormously difficult to start something in the Church of England because you need to have 6 months of habitual worship before you can have any governance, which is why you therefore need to start with the Bishop's Mission Order, which can have a CIO, which can have appointed trustees, who can then morph into a church council, which can then become some sort of elected PCC on the basis of of habitual worship. And so that's an aspect that needs to be looked at, because we're hardwired for decline and we need to be hardwired for growth. The second point to make comes out of that, which is that one of the models that's used in the Bishop's Mission Order legislation is that of the guild churches of the City of London, which, where the leader of the guild church, the guild vicar, has a right to place anybody whom he or she chooses onto the guild church roll. And that mirrors what I think might still be, although we have had a new measure and I haven't followed the detail, the case in some cathedrals. And that is another method for getting things going, but points up that we're talking here about PCCs, but there are lots of other church councils which are in our policy, which in any review would need to be taken into account. And the third point that I'd just like to make is that a church in our formularies is a place where the word of God is preached and the sacraments are celebrated. And the church, which is the body of Christ, not a metaphor, is rightly formed of those who are sacramentally engaged. Why? Because sacraments make a difference. The word of God inheres in the soul and leads us to Christ. The sacraments inhere in the soul and lead us to Christ. Both of those poles of our spirituality need to be engaged. And because we are not talking simply about the governance of a whole series of little charities, but about the living, breathing body of Christ, we need both sacraments and the word in equal measure at the heart of what we do, which is why I would wish to see not only habitual worship living under the word of God, but also habitual being busy about the sacraments, in order that that part of our spirituality also grows in our hearts and in the governance of our churches.
As no one is requesting to speak, we're now going to put item 79 to the vote. Those in favour of 79, please show. Those against, please show. That is clearly carried. So we now move to item 80, the amendment, and I invite Amanda Robbie to come and speak to and move the amendment in her name. You have up to 5 minutes, Amanda.
Thank you. Amanda Robbie, Lichfield 339. This is my maiden speech. What a strange thing to make a maiden speech on an amendment. So thank you for indulging me, Synod. I'm really pleased that Canterbury Diocese has raised this issue of PCC and electoral roll membership in their motion asking for this review. And my amendment seeks to expand the scope of the review they've asked for. Local church governance can be a lovely and precious thing. I'm sure you'll agree. However, churches can be hampered in their mission and ministry by broken or damaged people. Sadly, some individuals seek to hinder our work rather than build it up. And so PCCs need better protection. The church representation rules are not robust enough, and they clash with our church safeguarding legislation, leaving PCCs actually unable to safeguard the church. So my amendment has two parts, if you look on your yellow sheets. Firstly, I've removed those phrases which begin in the light of, and that's just about expanding the scope of this review that Canterbury have so wonderfully asked for, in order for other input to be made. And I have a couple of things that I would like covered in a review. One would be to look at whether it's appropriate for PCC members to be nominated by close family members. And the other is that a review should consider the use of the return of nomination system, known as RON, especially in student bodies. Other elected bodies use this mechanism to prevent unsuitable people from being elected, even if they stand unopposed. And this would protect PCCs who are struggling to find members from being hijacked by people with less good intent. Some members of the Synod may well have further suggestions for a review with respect to PCC membership and electoral roll registration, and I urge them to send them in. Secondly, I've added my third clause because I'm seeking to move quickly with the substance of the Lichfield diocesan motion that I'm sure you've all read, lurking at the bottom of your full agenda for this group of sessions. The motion was submitted because the church representation rules and church wardens measure are out of line with the Safeguarding and Clergy Discipline measure of 2016 and the new Safeguarding e-manual, with which I'm sure you're all familiar. Provisions made under the 26 measure for the disqualification and barring from office of child sex offenders and fraudsters cannot be applied under the current rules. The church representation rules incorporate some of the provisions made in the 2016 measure, but the rules have internal contradictions. The Safeguarding e-manual, published in January this year, states that current legislation relies on self-disclosure by an individual, and so it is limited by its effectiveness at preventing individuals on any barred list from becoming PCC members and/or church wardens. Synod, our current rules rely entirely on trust, but sadly, people lie. Those with backgrounds of child sexual abuse and fraud have strong motivation to lie, and sadly, trust cannot be enough in our rules. So this amending clause that I've put forward seeks to address this problem by asking, requesting a review of those legislative clashes, which I understand Synod, the NCIs are aware of. So, firstly, our rules need to be brought into line with the 2016 measure to allow safer recruitment. And secondly, additional legislation is going to be needed to bar or remove any disqualified person from holding office. And sadly, no such effective legislation exists at this time. I know it's been a bit technical, but there is a problem which needs to be reviewed and corrected. So, in order for our PCCs to be more effective, to be better protected, to do more work, ministry, mission in our parishes, through an expanded review and corrections to the legislation, I beg to move the amendment that stands in my name. Thank you.
I now invite David Kemp to indicate whether item 80, whether you accept, we're dealing with them separately, although Amanda, you've helpfully spoken to them both, we're going to treat them separately. Right. Item 80 as an amendment, do you accept it or not?
Yes.
You do? Well, that was painless, wasn't it? Okay, in which case, item 80 is now open for debate. I call Timothy Norwood, followed by this lady here. Thank you. Your speech limit is 3 minutes. We still have another amendment to get through. Thank you.
Thank you. Timothy Norwood, 188 Oxford Diocese. I'm the Area Dean of Milton Keynes, and over the last 40 years, we've had 25 new congregations planted or grown in our city area. Only one of them is a bishop's mission order. And as I look back over the history, one of the things that we've been conscious of is the problems with membership, partly because so many of the projects that have been formed ecumenically in partnership with other churches, not just in the distant past, but even now in the present. There's a wonderful project called Church Without Walls, which we're running with the URC. Look it up on the internet. It's a really brilliant project. But working in that way creates all sorts of difficulties in terms of membership and the amount of time that has been wasted trying to resolve issues of membership have created all sorts of problems in terms of conflict, inability to engage properly with new congregations. And so I therefore welcome this amendment, number 80, in the widening of the scope and the indication that there are other issues in terms of new congregations and growing communities which we must address in terms of membership in order to save time and make them much more effective. So please support this amendment. It will be very helpful for us. Thank you.
Mary Talbot, 308 Europe. I was really delighted to see the general motion because if you think that these forms are incomprehensible in England, I can tell you they are absolutely gobbledygook if you live on the continent. Most of the people who come into our church in Geneva don't actually know what an Anglican church is, and many of our congregation come from different churches. So I would really, really hope that if we pass this motion, which I understand from Amanda's explanation is to open it further, that we don't lose sight of how complicated this is for people who are not cradle Anglicans to understand. Thank you.
I'm now going to test the mind of Synod on a motion for closure on item 80. Those in favour of a motion for closure? Those against? The motion for closure is carried. And so we now move to a vote on item 80. Those in favour? Those against? Item 80 is carried. Thank you. We now come to item 81, where I'm afraid you need to come and move the amendment in your name. Thank you.
Amanda Robbie, Lichfield 339. I beg to move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. If David could come and indicate whether he accepts or does not accept the amendment. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, you rather took me by surprise with your question about 80s. And I replied too quickly. No, I meant yes. But I also wanted to say thank you very much to Amanda, again, with whom I've had conversations. This seems to me to be complementary to our original motion. Our original motion is about opening things up. And this particular amendment is about making sure we're protected, even though we open things up. So I'm very happy indeed to accept the amendment.
Item 81 is now open for debate, and the speech limit will be 2 minutes. So, yes, Paul Butler, and thank you. Yes, Simon Butler, sorry, I had a moment there. It's 10 to 9.
Elevated there for a moment. Simon Butler, Southwark 221. I was really grateful for this amendment because it reminded me of my safer recruitment training when I found myself in a situation where we were discussing the safer recruitment of PCC members and others, and it struck me that PCC members are elected by the annual meeting and church wardens are elected by the annual vestry meeting. Electorates that have no control, and we have no control over who votes in those elections, particularly in the election of church wardens. And I found myself wondering, how on earth could I go through safer recruitment for people who I could not control the election of? And it seems to me that this review will allow us to ensure that we ask the questions about how we can have properly democratic processes without putting ourselves in jeopardy around issues around safeguarding. So I welcome this amendment and it will help me ease my conscience about how I can interfere in what is, after all, a democratically elected process. Thank you.
Paul Ayres, Leeds 131. I agree very much with what Simon has just said, and I'm very grateful to Amanda for bringing this amendment. I just wonder if it's possible that we could explore in the review even further. I really wish there was a code of conduct for church wardens and PCCs, as many many organisations have such a thing, and that for serious misconduct or bringing the organisation into disrepute, there are penalties. And maybe this is opening up a can of worms, but sadly, as we have known for many, many years, bullying, harassment, narcissistic behaviour can occur by laity against clergy, by laity against each other, and it's never been addressed. There's never been anything we can do about it. And I just wonder if this might be an opportunity for the review to look in that direction. Thank you.
I would like to test the mind of Synod on a motion for closure on item 81. Those in favour? Those against? The motion for closure is carried. We will now vote on item 81, so the amendment. Those in favour of the amendment? Those against? That is carried. So we now return to a debate on the main motion as amended. Thank you. Yes, gentleman here, and thank you. The speech limit will need to be 2 minutes, please.
Tom Wolford, Blackburn 070. I actually made my maiden speech on Saturday, but I forgot to say so. So if you could give me the leniency that I should have had then. We are a word and sacrament church. No word, no church. No sacrament, no church. I'm grateful that this motion, the briefing paper that's been attached to this motion has raised a real and serious anomaly in our arrangements. The anomaly is there are highly engaged members of our church communities, maybe even leaders of fresh expressions, that don't meet the requirement for membership of our PCCs to be an actual communicant, but who would make great additions to the spiritual and practical leadership of our churches. But the remedy for that anomaly, and I suspect we're going to vote in favour of having this review, and so I guess I'm speaking to the review that might happen. The remedy for that anomaly lies not with reviewing and potentially changing our canonical requirement, which emerges from our historic ecclesiology. Oh, 2 minutes is very short, isn't it? Yeah, no, I think I'll, yes. To make the change envisioned in the briefing paper concerning this motion dilutes the link between our historic formularies, a word and sacrament church, and our on-the-ground ecclesiology. And so in seeking to make, to more fully embrace messy church, this review risks what we define as a church messy. That was the good line that I wanted to finish with.
After our next speaker, I call Pat Hawkins, please. And we really are going to need to be as brief as possible, but up to 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for calling me Chair. Greenwood, Southwark, 4 and 5. I was very much involved, as some of you will know, in the 2019 church representation stuff. So I'm speaking to this review too. First of all, Clive, I hope you will invite members of Synod to contribute to the review. Secondly, I'm hoping that some people are thinking, well, we have a miscellaneous provisions measure already underway, so can we use that to get some of these changes done more quickly and use that route? When I was growing up, I was aware of a document in the porch of my parish church which said expectations of members of the Church of England, which we've sadly lost, and we could find that and put it up in our porches again and get that spelt out. So that's an existing document. Very keen on the electronic stuff. I've been asked to raise that by Charlton Deanery, and I'm passionate, as you know, about the review of the 1956 PCC measure and bringing that up to date. So thank you very much.
Pat Hawkins, Lichfield 145. Let me begin by saying that I'm in great sympathy with the thrust of this motion, with the lowering of barriers and the simplification of processes. My sticking point is the second sentence of GS 2255A, which, in referring to fresh expressions, simply states that most of these forms of worship are non-Eucharistic. Full stop. Accepting as I do that fresh expressions of church are church in their own right and not a route into traditional church, I am deeply worried by that full stop. The theological underpinning of that worry has already been set out eloquently. Let me simply add that we must be careful not to imply, I'm sure unintentionally, that sacraments, as opposed to the manner of their celebration, are somehow problematic in mission terms. John Wesley spoke of communion as a converting ordinance, and there have been few people more able to bring the gospel to the unchurched. Having said that, I'm all in favour of review. Thank you.
I now invite David to respond. Oh, no, sorry, I'd like to put the motion for closure before you on this item. Those in favour of the motion for closure on item 81? Those against? The motion for closure is carried. So we now vote on... No, so sorry. David, would you please come respond to the debate? Thank you.
Madam Chair, it's been one of those debates, hasn't it? First of all, thank you to everybody who's come to take part in this debate. I have to say, had I been you, I'd have looked at the agenda and thought, not the most exciting part of Synod, but thank you so much for coming and for taking part. 3.5 maiden speeches, wow. And remind me never to follow Tom Wolford. Sandra Turner, speaking from experience about the group opposed to the mission of the church. And Matt Beer, wondering whether there was a community of members and whether it could be non-Eucharistic. Thank you to Holly from Canterbury. There was a 3-line whip on people from Canterbury actually supporting the motion. Free and fair, obviously. Peter Adams, the heart of the motion is the mission of the church. I'll leave others to decide whether it should be Archbishop's Council or the Business Committee. And then we have James Carey, and cricket appeared. Oh, my heart leapt. The rules of cricket are very simple. There's one side that's in and the other side that's out. And never mind, that's a tea towel. And the idea of cricket or the governance of the Church of England being explained to St Paul. Thank you, James. It's a lovely idea. Robin, I think you may be about 5 years ahead of your time asking where the app is, but it's a good question to ask. And Luke, thank you. Being hardwired for growth. That's a good phrase, thank you. Timothy supporting the motion and the amendment from experience. And Mary Talbot coming in from Europe, who, what they do about cricket or St Paul, I've no idea. Simon, thank you, Simon. The business of safer recruitment is very serious, and we take it very seriously when it's got safeguarding attached to it, but not so seriously necessarily when it's got PCCs attached to it. So the idea of proper process is good. And Paul Ayres, the code of conduct, well, I think a lot of people would think that would be a very good idea and then would blanch at the bother of doing it. We've already mentioned Tom, and I wasn't sure where the speech started or ended, but it was great fun. Thank you, Tom. And Adrian, with his great experience, wondering whether there should be a miscellaneous provisions measure. And Pat bringing us back to earth again, just that niggle about non-Eucharistic churches. Yeah, it's there, we have to deal with it. we have to work with it. I'm very grateful. Thank you, Madam Chair, for looking after me and telling me what to do at the right moments. And so I beg to move.
Thank you. We now put item 31 as amended to the vote. Those in favour? Those against? The motion is carried. That concludes this item. Thank you.
Thank you, members. We come now to the Diocesan Synod motion on age verification for pornography websites, for which you will need GS 2274A and GS 2274B. I call upon the Reverend Joe Wynne-Smith to move the motion number 32 on your order paper 7. You have up to 10 minutes.
Good evening, Synod, and thank you for your engagement with this important social issue. Friends, age verification for accessing online pornography ought to be a no-brainer, so why are we here? Film certification has had long precedent, so why this omission in online regulation? The internet has capacity for great good, inspiring the imagination, knowledge sharing, friendship building. Yet it is also a place where the darker side of life is prevalent, influencing and encouraging and shaping emotional and spiritual health. The government is playing catch-up at present, and pressure needs to be maintained on them to ensure these protections are enacted. A little background. Research reveals that almost a quarter of young people have never spoken with their parents or carers about sex. Research also shows that the majority of young people have seen pornography online, and the vast majority of older teens, whether seeking it out or not, have accessed it within the last week when asked. This is an issue which parents and children themselves are highly concerned about. And I'm afraid I disagree with GS 2274B. The research of both Dr. Fiona Viraguri at Durham and Professor Jane Monckton, the expert on intimate partner violence, argues strongly for how easily accessible pornography is increasingly extreme and violent, misogynistic, objectifying women, normalising non-consent and coercion, as well as promoting unrealistic attitudes towards sex and body image. Exposure to sexualised material is more likely to lead to young people engaging in more sexualised behaviour and to feel social pressure to have sex and to think that they can and should have sex in these unhealthy ways in relationships. So what is the government doing about this? The Online Harms White Paper has identified these risks and the needs for the legislation, and the Online Safety Bill intends to address it. The industry has even already begun to develop tools to address the matter. So why has the Leatherhead Deanery and Guildford Darson Synod brought this motion? This is a question of maintaining pressure on the parliamentary process, because this was originally proposed by David Cameron back in 2013 and was supposed to become law in 2019. At first, it was delayed because of bungled administration. The EU hadn't been properly notified of the proposed legal changes. Then it was postponed to ensure it was part of the wider online harms plans. Friends, there is a time for reasonable patience, and then there is time for principled frustration. The Church, with other churches and faith leaders, with children charities like Bernardo's, the NSPCC, Save the Children and UNICEF and the Children's Commissioner are all concerned and have been working together to ensure that it maintains its place in the legislative proposals and is not omitted again. If we think of 2013, that's 9 years ago. When you're a child, that's a very long time. In that time, many children have gone from childhood to adulthood and will have experienced pornography in ways that have damaged them. These children have been missed out by the fact that these proposals have still not come through. We need to be aware that some groups might seek to weaken or dismiss the proposals again, citing libertarian rights or concerns on privacy, lest users' details from verification processes might lead to profiling, even to, they themselves say this, embarrassment, or even hacking and blackmail. The protection of children must trump this concern, and it's unacceptable that the loophole remains unclosed. Perhaps those who are embarrassed might prefer to simply modify their behaviour. After all, it is this kind of risky behaviour that makes it attractive to them, and yet at the same time, this is being put ahead of the needs of children, their embarrassment. We also have the reassurance that the UK Gambling Commission has already put in place similar controls to protect people, so we know it is possible. The need to safeguard children and young people is something about which we can all unite. We can acknowledge it is still not a silver bullet, but that doesn't mean that it isn't an important part of a package of measures that can be implemented to safeguard them. The Online Safety Bill also looks at issues around pornography on social media and search engines, and this is also important. And we know that the bishops are on side to encourage this going through in the House of Lords. And this is also something of concern. I personally know of young people who have been sent unsolicited photographs and how deeply distressing that has been to them. Our children need protecting from these images and from these films. Additionally, as parents, as communities, as churches and schools, we all have a part to play in seeking to support young people in their developing sexuality and as they start to experience romantic relationships. If we are silent and inactive regarding sex ed and even just talking to our children about relationships, it leaves a void, and that can and will be filled by others. Left unsupported and unguided, children are far more at risk from social pressure, exploitation or grooming by others, and by systems that seek to abuse their curiosity. By engaging with them, teaching them, modelling to them healthy adult relationships, backed up by social structures like these age-appropriate safeguards, including this essential measure of age verification, we can help young people to develop and grow and flourish as they mature. Friends, we need to maintain pressure on government to implement these important restrictions, acknowledging that they are part of a package of resources, but so that they can flourish and be blessed in their future relationships. I beg to move the motion that stands in my name.
Thank you. The motion is now open for debate. There are many people that have put in to request to speak, perhaps not surprisingly in view of the nature of the subject. And quite a lot of those are from people who would be making their maiden speeches. And so I shall be inclined to pay attention to those, not over and above everybody else, but at least to give some space to people who want to make maiden speeches this evening. And that does mean, of course, that recognition of faces is not so easy, because they're people that we haven't yet all got to know quite as well as we know some others. So I wonder if I could begin by just asking, do I see Julie Maxwell standing? Thank you. If you would like the first speech, please, with 5 minutes. And following Julie Maxwell, Steve Wilcox. Is Steve Wilcox standing? Thank you. That would be 5 minutes as well. And after that, I will go down to 3 minutes, because that will allow us to hear more voices. Thank you.
Julie Maxwell, Winchester 429. Thank you for calling me for my maiden speech. It's a bit late at night for me, so bear with me. I'm a paediatrician, and the welfare of children is my absolute priority. I also work for Lovewise, a Christian charity which produces resources on subjects of puberty, growing up, relationships and marriage. One of our most popular school resources, which I've used to teach lessons in secondary schools, is entitled Pornography, Dangers and Decisions. While teaching these lessons over the past 10 years, there's been a noticeable change in the attitudes of young people. Much of this is a result of increased accessibility. More and more porn is available online, and almost all teens and tweens have smartphones in their pockets, many of them without any restrictions on what they can access. Whilst in the context of a lesson, teenagers seem very well able to understand the dangers of pornography, they can articulate the many ways in which it can be damaging, it's increasingly evident that a majority of them are already accessing it or seeing it as normal. In the lessons that I've taught, boys will often attempt to justify why it's actually okay to watch porn. They won't really get addicted. They know it's not reality, and yet they're still watching it. But actually what I found even more disturbing as a woman is the attitude of many of the girls, and we're talking 13-year-olds here. Although they're very aware of how porn objectifies women and frequently involves degrading and violent acts, they seem to have come to a point where it's been so normalised that they accept their boyfriends will be watching it. As a result of the widespread availability of porn to children and young people, they are growing up in a culture where violent, degrading and harmful sexual activity is being normalised. Both boys and girls are being led to believe that this is what is expected of them. And this is actually made worse by some of the relationships and sex education teaching in schools, which also normalises porn and some harmful sexual practices. There was a debate in Westminster last month which detailed some of the very extreme relationships and sexual education material that is currently being used in schools. Some resources tackling the issue of porn actually expose children to pornographic material, and parents often aren't aware of this. Children are a gift from God, and as adults we are responsible for their development and for protecting them from harm. Proverbs 22 verse 6 says, "Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it." What children are exposed to as they're developing develops them as adults. So it's absolutely vital that under 18s, whose brains are still very much developing, are protected from accessing porn by age verification, especially as for many, many young people, their first exposure is accidental. It's also important that teaching in schools enables them to make good decisions about aspects of their lives which will impact on their future well-being. They need to be protected from anything which normalises violent, degrading and abusive sexual practices and relationships, whether this is material they're accessing themselves or what is being taught to them in schools. So I urge you to support this motion in order to protect children who are most vulnerable to the harms of pornography. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve Wilcox, and after Steve Wilcox, the Bishop of Guildford.
Steve Wilcox, York 244, Chair, sisters and brothers.
like many who've spoken to topics that surprised them, I never imagined my maiden speech would be in this debate, but perhaps it's appropriate because I too have a story to tell. I went to a boarding school as a teenager. So-called soft pornographic magazines were a form of currency. I saw my share of images, and the effect on me was corroding, devastating, and addictive. To this day, I deeply regret those years, but I am also thankful that I didn't grow up in the age of the internet and the smartphone. Yes, I am that old, in which stronger forms of pornography are freely available to anyone of any age, as we've just heard. In recent years, I've heard of the long-term damage that such access has done to many young people at such a formative stage of their lives, and it makes me weep. When I came to faith at university, I came to realise for the first time that I personally had sinned against God, including in the area of lust, that in his love for me, Jesus had died for me personally, that I needed to respond to his love in repentance and faith. I've since learned that repentance and faith isn't a one-off event, it's a daily choice, as I choose to reject my variety of sinful tendencies, to trust that God's ways are better, and to follow Jesus by dying to self, taking up my cross, following him and finding real life as I do. And I've come to learn, and I'm still learning, that Jesus is the supremely beautiful one who satisfies in a way that nothing else on earth can. No relationship, no experience, no pleasure can satisfy or bring joy in the way Jesus does. And I found, wonder of wonders, that I am God's precious, deeply loved child, not because of my past or my present or my future, but because of Christ's death and resurrection for me. God looks at me and he sees Christ. All the shame, all the guilt are gone forever. Why do I share these things? Well, first, in the light of the ongoing conversations around LLF, to observe we are all sexually damaged, every one of us. And Jesus calls all of us to follow him, to find he is more beautiful, more satisfying than that other thing we find attractive, and to find our identity in him alone. And second, because I would wholeheartedly support the motion, and I would encourage us to strengthen the theology in the paper. It's not just that children are made in God's image and that we need to care for them, that's true. It's that Jesus calls each of us to repent and believe, to follow him for his glory and our blessing. He calls each of us to gouge out our eye. He tells us that if we look at another person lustfully, we've already committed adultery with them in our heart. He tells us, and many of us have found, that to drink from anything other than Christ is to drink from dry and cracked cisterns. And he warns us, Jesus warns us, if anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them if a large millstone were hung around their neck and they were thrown into the sea. So let us pass this motion, and let us do all we can to stop the scourge of pornography in this land. Thank you.
The Bishop of Guildford, with a speech limit now of 3 minutes for everyone, please. And after the Bishop of Guildford, Fiona Jack.
Andrew Watson, 20 Guildford, and the man charged with explaining the governance of the Church of England to St Paul. Chair, thank you very much for calling me, and thank you especially to the Business Committee for squeezing this time-sensitive diocesan synod motion into quite such a tight agenda. As some of my fellow bishops know, it's possible for a diocesan synod motion to be passed with the bishop themselves not in complete agreement with it. But such is emphatically not the case with this debate. The impact of hardcore pornography as a whole, and especially its objectification of women and normalisation of non-consensual sex, both degrades its viewers and those who produce it. It also has alarming connections with exploitation and modern-day slavery, and when accessed quite so freely and easily by children and young people, the harm it can do is incalculable. I want to pay tribute this evening to Reverend Jo Wynne-Smith, whose maiden speech at General Synod has been delivered with such poise and assurance. And also to the Reverend Charlene Hollington, one of our self-supporting ministers in the diocese, who first added this item to the agenda of her Deanery Synod back in October 21. Charlene would have been here sitting in the public gallery had she not been called to South Africa last week following the unexpected death of her mother. She has been campaigning on this issue for more than a decade, writing to MPs and seeking to bring it to the public's attention, and it's often been an uphill battle despite the almost self-evident justness of her cause. That's partly been due to practical concerns about just how age verification might be introduced and whether, as Joe has already raised and answered, it could aid hackers and potential blackmailers. But it's also reflected the fact that pornography as a whole is an issue we find very difficult to talk about, especially in church circles, both because of and despite the cycle of addiction and shame in which a considerable number of our fellow believers, both young and old, and statistically a significant number within this synod, are currently caught up. How important that we talk into that silence, among others, to our children, yes, but also among ourselves, not in some kind of self-righteous moralising way, but in response to an industry whose bright side is pretty dark and whose shadow side is very dark indeed. The main thing I'd like to bring to this debate, though, is a personal commitment to seek to advance this cause in Parliament, along with my fellow bishops, now that I'm beginning to find my way around the House of Lords. As the paper makes clear, the argument here is far from one, and a clause which currently sits within the online safety bill could all too easily be amended out of it. Should we gain the overwhelming, hopefully unanimous support of this synod, that eventuality would be reduced for those of us engaged at a parliamentary level. One person's passion, a deanery synod motion leading to a diocesan synod motion, leading to a general synod motion, leading to a tightening of the law, leading to considerably greater protection for our children and young people, leading to better sex and a happier society. Just think of that. Might even result in deanery synod elections being as tightly fought as the race to become the next leader of the Conservative Party.
Time is up. So Fiona Jack, then with 3 minutes, and Rebecca Chapman with 3 minutes to follow as well. Thank you.
Fiona Jack, London 161. Thank you very much for this opportunity to make a maiden speech, Madam Chair. In my other life, I run a qualitative market research business doing focus groups and in-depth interviews on a whole variety of topics for commercial companies. 2 months ago, I was asked by, shall we say, a large, well-known search engine and video platform company to conduct some research on precisely this topic, age verification amongst children online. I did some depth interviews with children aged between 10 and 17, some young adults as well, to find out what they had done before they were 18 and so on. Those of us who are parents may or may not be surprised to know that almost every child admitted to me that they had lied about their age or faked their age online. And they were quite pleased to tell me how easy it was to do it. Several children said, well, actually, for this one, I have to have my mum's email details, but I know what her email address is, and I know her password, so I can just pretend to be her. So this is just to really highlight, age verification is very, very important, but it's not easy to do in practice. So we have to be careful, I think, what we wish for and think very carefully about how we do this. It's not just pornography that is a danger. As we've touched on, there are violent videos, things like Grand Theft Auto. I had a 10-year-old telling me that his 14-year-old brother allowed him access to play that. It's a game which is 18. It's extremely violent, very, very unsuitable for a younger child. So I think I really do support this motion. What I do think, though, is we need to be careful what we wish for. We need to work out how age verification can be done. One of the things we actually did as part of this piece of research was we looked at different methods, but when I tell you about some of them, they are very, very intrusive. So, for example, we explored tracking people's, the other websites that people have visited to check their age. We also talked about biometric data. So basically you can tell people's age from their facial features and the way they look, their appearance and so on. I find these to be personally very, very intrusive. And so I wholeheartedly support this motion. But I think more thought is needed about the extent of it. It's not just pornography, it's violence and horror as well, that was also mentioned. And we need to think very thoroughly and carefully about how age verification is done. Thank you.
I've called Rebecca Chapman, and then after Rebecca, the Archbishop of York has indicated he wishes to speak, so he has a turn after that.
Rebecca Chapman, Southwark 414. Thank you, Chair. As the mother of 3 sons still at school, this is a topic I'm increasingly aware has very real consequences for them and the conversations that I have with them. While I very much agree about the harms of online pornography, and I welcome the requirement for more social and educational programmes to increase awareness, I have some serious concerns about Section B of this motion. The emphasis on a legislative solution, and specifically the proposal for age verification systems. For Synod, while this is a laudable aim in theory, this particular part of the motion, as with the government's online safety bill itself, will sadly not have the desired effect, and may even cause more problems than it solves, providing little or no protection. This is government legislation written by those who have no understanding of the way in which the internet actually works in practice. Perhaps, given MPs' inability to Google tractors without coming across porn by mistake, this is less surprising than it might appear. The UK is not China, and we do not have a firewall in the middle of the English Channel. So when you want to look at a website, it doesn't matter if the server is located in Cambridge or Cambodia. It is simply not possible to legislate for those websites not hosted in the UK, which is the majority of them. The very nature of the internet means such legislation would require you to enter age verification to view the online version of page 3 of The Sun, but sadly would be simply ignored and likely unenforceable for the majority of hardcore material available on Pornhub or other similar international sites. This might well be actively harmful, as parents who are tech-aware or just avoidant will be lulled into a false sense of security, believing that age verification has solved it, and not realising this is merely a legislative fig leaf. So, Synod, instead of just encouraging legislation which is sadly flawed, we need to focus our efforts on education, both of our teenagers and young people, but also of our parents, teachers, church leaders and youth ministers. We cannot turn back the tide of an open internet, and we shouldn't pretend that we can. And I would love us to go far, far further than Section C of this motion and not devolve responsibility by merely recommending more social and educational programmes, but each of us consider how, as church leaders, youth workers, parents, lay workers, synod members, how we might teach and maybe even preach on this subject, about what is out there online, about how to browse and behave safely and appropriately online, and above all, to be open, honest and realistic when the time is right about what real and fulfilling sex might actually be like. Thank you.
Thank you. The Archbishop of excuse me. The Archbishop of York, and after the Archbishop of York, Abigail Ogier, please.
Stephen Cottrell, 002, Archbishop of York. Thank you for calling me Chair, and thank you so much to Guildford Diocese for bringing this really important debate. I spent the best part of 4 years as a member of the House of Lords Select Committee for Communication, where most of the work we did during that time was looking into the matter of how you can regulate the internet and to make it a safe place for children and young people. And as the Bishop of Guildford mentioned, Lord Spiritual continue to take a great interest in this issue in the House of Lords, particularly around the online safety harm bill. And contrary to the last couple of speakers, I spent Tuesday afternoon after Tuesday afternoon speaking to people in the industry, often asking them, so what could be done, what could be done? And you know what? Those clever algorithms that are so good at selling us stuff, these clever people who make these things do say we could do something. We can't, of course, we cannot live in an entirely safe world, but we can actually bring in age verification, which will make the internet a lot safer than it is. But the fundamental point I wanted to make was more of a philosophical and ethical one about how we inhabit the internet full stop. People like Facebook and Twitter and other internet providers, they like to call themselves platforms. And I think we really need to challenge this philosophically. The thing about a platform is it's something that you stand on, and you, the platform, have no responsibility for what goes on. The fundamental corner we need to turn is to see that the internet is not a platform, it is a public space. And therefore all the rights and norms of public behaviour that we expect in a public space should apply in the internet. So it isn't actually about protecting children from the internet, it is actually making the internet safe by design. Safe by design. And this could be done, but I think we need regulation to make it happen, and we need a code of practice and a code of conduct. And that is what bishops in the House of Lords are campaigning for alongside others. In the 1970s, we quite famously put fluoride in the water supply. And the reason we did that is because we knew it would be great for dental health. Sisters and brothers, what we, the church, need to be in the forefront of campaigning about is putting some fluoride in the internet to make it a safe place for everyone, and especially for our children and our young people.
Thank you. Abigail Ogier and then Mike Tufnell, please. Still 3 minutes.
Abigail Ogier, Manchester 364. Thank you, Chair, for calling me. Until a call to chaplaincy took my life in a different direction 4 years ago, I spent most of my career working for the excellent children's charity, Bernardo's. The last 5 of my 16 years with them were spent as regional lead for domestic abuse work, and in that role I worked as part of a cluster of managers managing specialist trauma services. In those services we really saw close up the impact of pornography on children and young people. We saw it in my own service when they started dating and reflected the unhealthy attitudes to sex and consent, or lack of consent, that they had seen online. We saw it in our child sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation services, where children were highly traumatised after being forced or coerced into watching pornography by adults. But the thing that I found the most disturbing personally was how my colleague in the service for children exhibiting harmful sexualised behaviour spoke of the changes they were seeing in their client group. Historically, this had been made up largely of children who themselves had been sexually abused and had gone on to replicate that abuse towards their peers. But they were starting to see a new category of children, children who appeared to have been exposed to a very happy and secure and safe childhood, but their behaviour changed after they started accessing extreme porn online. Now, Fiona, Jo and Rebecca have all pointed out that age verification on its own is not a silver bullet, although I do tend to agree with Archbishop Stephen that there is more to be done than some might like to think. However, it's not the sole solution, and so I would particularly like to support the third clause of this motion, looking for education. And I particularly want to think about what that might look like. Of course, in the ideal world, information about sex and relationships would be delivered by sensitive, well-informed and open parents, but not all parents are like that. So we need to ensure that all children have access to good, clear information. It mustn't just be about sex and pornography. It must also cover consent and relationships and respect. And it must be suitable to the needs of all young people. That includes LGBTQI+ young people. And it must be delivered in places that can be safe spaces for all young people, not just in the classroom, but in a whole range of small groups. So, to sum up, I urge you all to support this motion and particularly to give attention to the third point and how we can support our schools, our youth workers and even our churches to deliver that information and education. Mike Tufnell, and then after Mike Tufnell, I'll turn to one of our ecumenical representatives and invite the Reverend Father Stephen Maxfield to speak to us. Thank you. The speech limit is still 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mike Tufnell, Salisbury 214. Earlier this evening, Holly Adams said she'd hoped to give her maiden speech on a sexier topic. I'd wish the opposite. I, like Steve Wilcox, am grateful that porn was not as accessible to me when I was a teenager. Here, by the grace of God, go I. I speak also this evening as a deeply concerned father, worried at what children can so easily access online today, via phones, computer games, social media, YouTube, even Disney Plus at times. And for that matter, I'm deeply concerned even about what they might be taught in schools as part of RSE lessons as well. I'll come back to that later. I speak also as a vicar to a church with significant numbers of young people that are or will be affected by this. And I speak as a pastor who's seen marriages break down as a direct result of addictions to pornography that began as teenagers. Let's make no bones about this. These porn sites are among the most insidious drug dealers to the youth of our nation. I would like to draw Synod's attention to a member of my youngest brother's congregation, Miriam Cates, MP for Penistone and Stockbridge in Sheffield, who recently gave an outstanding speech to the Backbench Business Select Committee, revealing the Wild West state of some of our so-called RSE providers contracted by schools, leading children as young as 10 to be exposed to radically age-inappropriate pornographic materials. So I'm hugely grateful to those who've brought this motion to Synod today, to charities like Youthscape, Care for the Family, we heard about Lovewise, who provide material to help in this area, to bring people to healing and freedom in Jesus. And despite all the bad news, I'm a glass half full person. I've only been on Synod for a few months, so why wouldn't I be? And I always try to look, like the Archbishop of York, to prophetic and positive steps that we could take. And I'd like to suggest just a couple of crazy ideas as I finish. One, imagine the day when a young person, or anyone for that matter, searches for sex or porn on Google and finds top of the list a paid-for link to a Christian, perhaps even Church of England-sponsored website that can help them find non-judgmental, good Samaritan help to get free of addiction and learn of the beautiful vision the Christian faith has for love, sex and marriage. Two, why can't we become the preferred provider for RSE teaching in our schools, if nowhere else, at least in our Church of England schools? I support this motion with all my heart, although I hope it's only the start of the journey. If we want to reach our young people with the grace and truth of our faith, let's meet them where they are at, even if it's online, even if it's searching for porn.
Father Maxfield next, and then after Father Maxfield, Ruth Allen. Thank you. Still 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, for calling me. I want to start with a slight explanation. In the Greek Orthodox Church, confession is practiced quite widely, not by everybody, but by many. Only certain priests are allowed to hear confessions. They are ordained with the laying on of hands, and then they may hear confessions. I am one of those, and I was ordained to do this, to become a pneumatikos, 32 or 33 years ago. As a result, I hear confessions not only from my own community, but from all over the place where people come to repent of their sins. 30 years ago, I very seldom had a confession that was about pornography. Now, this does not only affect men, it also affects women. There are women who look at pornography. But now, it isn't every confession, but it is most. And I hear hundreds, many hundreds of confessions every year. This is a disaster. It is a disaster not just for children. It is disaster for middle-aged people, even old-aged people. The men are filled with shame and self-disgust. They may be impotent as a result. The women or the partners that they are with are ashamed that they have been so unsuccessful as a lover. This is a terrible thing. It is a catastrophe for all of us. I would implore you to do everything you can to fight this devil in our midst.
Ruth Allen, and then do I see, I'm sorry, I'm Fraser Oates standing up there. Thank you, yes, please. And then I shall be minded to test the mind of Synod for closure.
Thank you, Chair, for inviting me to speak. Ruth Allen, 317 Guildford. I'd like to thank Joe for presenting this motion so clearly and also for representing our diocese. We have an oldie and a newbie that you'll hear from tonight. In the excellent Fringe meeting that some of us attended, it was reiterated that pornography, as we've just heard, is a pandemic. We heard that it can start with just an innocent curiosity when a 12-year-old schoolboy was invited by his friend to view pornography images on his phone, simply just for fun. Yet a dark trajectory began, becoming a gripping addiction. Sadly, pornography has an impact on young girls and young women too. And this impact is deeply destructive and very sad. I have had the opportunity to listen to some young girls and young women where their boyfriend or partner have engaged in pornography. There is a trajectory too for young girls and young women. First, there's shock, a huge shock that the person that they liked or loved is engaging in porn. Their discovery is shattering, even though they may know that everybody's doing it. The shock then leads to confusion, uncertainty, and wavering commitment. After all, if everybody's doing it, should I accept this in my relationship? Then follows depression and anxiety, often leading to a need to seek professional counsel. But a recent study conducted in the University of Exeter by a postgraduate just recently highlighted the most damaging consequence on a young woman. They lose their self-worth, their self-esteem, value, and they struggle with their personal identity. So I call upon this synod to support this motion. I'm a retired dentist, and I've seen the fantastic impact of fluoride in the water. So we can do this. And like Julie, Abigail, and others, I plead that we educate our children, we teach them from the pulpit, in our churches, in our youth groups, and also round the table in our homes. Thank you.
Fraser Oates, and then I think we've perhaps got time for one more. Yes, please.
Fraser Oates, Worcester 238. Thank you for calling me chair for my maiden speech. As a millennial, I'm part of a generation of people who had this brief window of life without the internet, where football in the park was preferable to TikTok. Yet we're a generation as well that became rapidly immersed in the digital world as it exploded into life. As has been said, the internet is both a wonderful gift, but simultaneously a horrific and dangerous place to be. My school friends and I were only 10 years old before we encountered this emerging world of online porn. And looking back now, I think has been mentioned already, 10 is an incredibly young age. And it's this unrestricted and often unmonitored exposure to such licentiousness, such a young and formative age in life, it's deeply damaging. And the repercussions for people in my age bracket, they linger. And I continue today to journey pastorally with people who are still psychologically and spiritually imprisoned by this. Yet I grieve that those younger than me are today saturated in the digital world, and these issues have by no means gone away. Rather, they have become enormously exaggerated. And of course, we have visions for the metaverse, and these things show that there's no desire to slow down our technological online ambitions. Unless we intervene now, advances in technology will only lead to more widespread exposure to deeply harmful and obscene material for future generations. As this motion outlines, these issues have been catalysed. They have catalysed our hyper-sexualised culture, and they're having huge repercussions on how people see themselves, how they see other people, and how they see their relationships. And it's one thing for me testifying to the realities of harm inflicted upon my generation, but what terrifies me more is having 2 children under 10 who will soon undoubtedly be exposed to this evil too. We need to act now to break this cycle and contend for change. Saying this, and despite the issues raised by this motion, I've also discerned over the past few years this increasing level of positive support for porn and online sex work under the headlines of personal choice, female empowerment, and it's justified by a prevalent amoral belief system around sexual behaviour. And so for young people and children, like in many other areas of life, they're pulled in so many different directions as to what is right and healthy and good for themselves and wider society. So I wholeheartedly support this motion, but I also think that we could consider this more fully, more theologically, that such petitions from the Church of Jesus Christ find themselves shaped by a framework of Christian teaching and ethics, contending for love and purity and holiness. Thank you.
I'd like to call upon the speaker over on that podium, and then I really do think that I have to consider the putting to Synod the proposal for closure.
James Ridge, ex officio Chaplain General to Prisons 461. Thank you, Chair, for calling me for what is also my maiden speech. Members of Synod, this is where it begins. Few of those who do not have any contact with our prison system are aware of the sheer number of people convicted of sexual offences currently held within our prisons. As well as my responsibilities across England and Wales, I have a regional responsibility for prisons in the east of England, where we have the largest prison for people convicted of sexual offences in the whole of Europe, around 1,400 people. There are numerous others across England and Wales, as well as those being held in normal location in the rest of our prisons, generally keeping very quiet about the nature of their offences. You might imagine a group of elderly men, such as those convicted by Operation Yewtree, the investigation which followed in the wake of the discovery of Jimmy Savile. And there are certainly those, but there are also a lot of young men in their late teens and early 20s, and their story is by and large depressingly similar, and it is this. I started watching legal pornography and then graduated onto the illegal stuff. Time and again, people fall victim to this slippery slope, And it's those who start watching when they're 12 or 13 or even younger, who by the time they're 16 or 17 are watching illegal pornography. And by the time they're 20, they're serving prison sentences. And those in prison are just the tip of the iceberg. There are many more who don't make it as far as prison. I've watched in horror and great distress as the teenage daughters of friends who I love dearly suffer the effects of having been raped by their boyfriends. It can't be proven. It will never come to court. But it happened, and the story is the same. We watched it on the screen. We can take what we want when we want. We want to do it. Members of Synod, this motion is by no means the whole answer, but it is a start. If it can save one young man from the slippery slope which leads to prison, one young girl from the horror of rape and sexual assault, then it is worth doing, and I urge you to support it.
Thank you. As I indicated, and conscious of the clock at the end of what's a very long day, I now wish to test the mind of Synod on whether item 32 has been sufficiently debated, and I therefore put the motion for closure on item 32. Those in favour of the motion for closure, please show. Those against, please show. The motion for closure is carried. So I call upon Jo Wynne-Smith to respond to the debate. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to all of you who have contributed so powerfully to this discussion and debate. Thank you to Julie Maxwell for her work with children and schools and her concerns there. To Steve Wilcox for his honesty and his witness to the freedom he has discovered in Christ. Thank you to Bishop Andrew for giving us not just the background, but your commitment with other bishops to take this forward and deal with it properly. Thank you to Fiona Jack for your concerns about how young people can circumvent controls and that this is not straightforward and there needs to be more research and work to ensure that it is not just seen as a single way of addressing the issue. And also to Rebecca Chapman, I recognise that the legal background of companies involved in this are often difficult to pin down, but that's not a reason not to make sure that the loopholes we can close are closed. I also thank the Archbishop of York very much for his insights into the algorithms that can be both unhelpful but also have the potential to do great good. And I hope we all pray that that can be developed and enabled. Thank you for your image of the fluoride. I think we'll all remember that one from this synod. Thank you to Abigail Objer for her work with Bernardo's and her insights too, that this situation is getting worse. To Mike Tufnell, your insight around its similarity to being addicted to drugs and concerns over unregulated school sex ed, and that the church has potential to make a difference here. Father Stephen, thank you for your insights too. The impact of porn on confessions, the fact that so many are impacted by this. The church is not immune, and it is a spiritual, psychological, physiological and relational issue that needs to be addressed, a grave harm, the devil in our midst. Thank you to Ruth Allen for your contribution regarding the impact on partners and for reassuring us that fluoride does work. Finally, to Fraser Oates for your concerns, not just for your generation, but for your children. And I feel that very strongly too, having a 14-year-old and a 10-year-old. And lastly, to our Chaplain General, James Rich, you have shown us where this can end up, and yet you reveal to us that it is just the tip of the iceberg. This is so important that we need to play our part. This is not a silver bullet, friends, but it doesn't mean that it mustn't be done. But let us play our part in helping the future generations to grow up knowing about truly loving, caring relationships, and that what they find on the internet or in any other places are not necessarily to be trusted, and let us protect them so that they may grow and flourish. Synod, I beg you to vote for this motion.
Point of order. Point of order.
Point of order, Andrew Corns, Chichester 94. Chair, it's our practice not to applaud after a vote, but I wonder if you would allow us and indeed invite us to stand after the vote for 2 minutes of silent prayer for our children, young people, and indeed for the adults in our country.
Yes, that's not, as it's been pointed out to me, that's not actually a point of order, but I do think that I would be happy for us to remain silently in our places, to stand if you prefer, in order to think about and hold before God the anxieties that we have and the trauma that other people live with, and maybe some people in this chamber also themselves. We know have had all kinds of experiences which we wish to hold up with them, and so we will do that in silence after the vote. But at this point, we need to deal with the voting. Yes, the Zoom people can't hear what's going on if it's not on the microphone, I'm afraid. It's just one of those added complications of having a hybrid meeting.
With my voice, Madam Chair, they can hear me back in Coventry without a microphone. Sam Margrave, Coventry 295. Madam Chair, with your indulgence, I just wonder, on such an important issue for the nation, if we could show support, or show the support that we show to the nation by having a counted vote, a recorded vote.
Thank you.
Or whatever it's called.
I'm happy to... yes, you mean, I presume you mean, I don't wish to impute thoughts to anybody, but I presume you mean a counted vote of the whole synod?
Indeed.
Yes. Then I'm happy to exercise Chair's discretion in accepting that. So if people would make sure they've got access to a voting machine, that would be good. And it looks as if we are reasonably... This is not an opportunity for a chat. We're trying to get ourselves equipped with our machines. This is a counted vote of the whole synod on item 32. Those present in York using the voting handsets and who wish to vote in favour should press 1. Those against should press 2. Those who wish to record an abstention should press 3. Those participating remotely should use the online voting platform and vote or register an abstention using the buttons on the screen.
The voting period is now open and will end in 1 minute. voting period will end in 15 seconds. The voting period has now ended.
The result of the voting is as follows. For 263, against 2, recorded abstentions 3. So the motion is very clearly carried. And we did, I think, agree. I suggested that we should then have 2 minutes of silence, either standing if you wish, or sitting quietly and praying as you wish. And then I suggest, I would feel happy if we departed reasonably quietly on this occasion. Oh, there's Compline afterwards. Well, that's excellent, because Compline is a very good follow-on. Now I'd like to call upon the Archbishop of York to give us his blessing, and then we will have Compline afterwards.
I'll do that at the end of Compline.
At the end of Compline? Okay.